Welcome to the Zencast. My name is Dale Pickles. I'm one of the directors here at B Squared, and I am the host of the Zencast. The Zencast is here to help us all learn more about SEND. As I always say, there is lots of stuff you can go and read, and you can spend hours trawling the internet, but we're all very, very busy, and we just don't have that time to sit and read. The Zencast is also a great way to get the same consistent message to schools, external professionals, and parents. In this week's episode, we're discussing reducing workload by using high-value strategies for pupils with SEND in the classroom. My guest this week is Angela Scott. Angela is the regional lead for SEND for the Eastern Partnership UK and is the program lead for the NASENCO, Advanced SENCO, and SENCO's as Leaders Awards. She is also a member of a number of national working groups for SEND. The Zencast is created and produced by us here at B Squared. As well as this podcast, we also have our Zencast sessions, our online CPD. And if you haven't accessed a Zencast session, they are video CPD sessions, often with the same great guests as on the podcast. We run 9 live sessions and 2 free SEND briefings every year. And in September, we've got Jane Friswell coming in to talk about what's going to happen with SEND and the new government. That's a free session on the 24th of September. The sessions are £10 per school for the paid sessions, and you can watch them live on the day or you can watch them later on. We now have over 130 sessions you can purchase and use for CPD across the whole school. Have a look at the website and see what's available. But now, let's get on with the podcast. In this week's show, we're discussing reducing workload by using high-value strategies for pupils with SEND in the classroom. Discussing this topic with me is Angela Scott. Angela is the national lead for SEND in the Eastern Partnership UK and is the program lead for their NASENCO, the Advanced SENCO, and the SENCO as Leaders Awards. She is also a member of a number of national working groups for SEND. And as well as all her training, she is also the author of Apt2Go, an audit and planning tool to help schools around self-improvement. Welcome to the show again, Angela.
Thank you, Dale. It's good to be here.
You are welcome. Over the years, and we're now hitting 4, which is quite scary, we've had many guests on the podcast and we've discussed different types of need, discussing different areas like SALT or OT or different approaches like yoga or various other things. But often, if you kind of squint, there is always this underlying theme or underlying approaches that comes up again and again. It's like there is this magic pill. I'm going to say it.
George's Marvellous Medicine.
But yet no one really outside of the SENCO world seems to be listening.
Right. Well, there's a great place to start, and let's do some stories first. Let's set the scene. So, where have I been in the last little while that I've seen certain practices happening in schools? Working with a range of specialist teacher organisations across local authorities when they used to exist, teachers would often go into schools on the back of a referral about a particular young person. Questions would be asked, discussions would be had, and a range of strategies would be noted and hopefully followed up. A couple of weeks later, that same school might call the specialist teacher services and say, oh, we've got another child, different year group. So on their white charger, the specialist teacher would go into the school and have a conversation and talk about this young person, each unique, so two unique individuals. But if that specialist teacher were to sit in the car park in their car afterwards and cross-reference some of the strategies they were genuinely recommending that from their experience, their knowledge and research would make a positive impact on those young people in the classroom, they would see some enormous similarities. So you're right, we can seek to train our schools, our teachers in the art of being dyslexia friendly. We can do a similar job of work around using the autism standards and getting ourselves autism friendly or ADHD friendly, etc. But what happens each time we do that, we often put our teacher colleagues into a position of overload. So now I've got to take on this whole gamut of stuff around children who might have long-term literacy difficulty, dyslexia. That was the spring term. So now, summer term, I've got to take on this whole gamut of stuff around young people who might have a hyperactive ADHD profile. I am now in that overwhelmed position. I can't do SEN anymore. Has that come across in the sort of conversations
Yes.
in previous podcasts?
Yes, exactly that. And what you'll find is that that person doing the training even hasn't, in the spring where they did dyslexia and come to the summer, doesn't go, and this, just like in the dyslexia training we discussed last term, is this. They don't even link the ones. They're not even helping you see when they're doing these 3 siloed trainings that actually we mentioned these 4 strategies in the last training because it works for everyone. They don't do that. It's literally like, this is fresh information. This is completely new. This is a completely separate section. It's a completely separate area. This is all new information, not kind of linking it back to actually, this came up in the autism training in the autumn and it came in dyslexia training in the spring and now we're doing it again in the ADHD. So you can see how important it is. That doesn't seem to happen.
Okay, so thank you for that. That's taken the stories into a great zone, and still sitting in a car park and pondering on why this is. I suppose there might be a number of reasons, perhaps to do with an overly medicalized model of categorizing the perceived profile of young people and or adults. Let's just take that one for a moment. So if I go back many years, I taught in the States for a bit, and I came across the very first child I'd ever met who had a diagnosis of something, a diagnosis of ADHD, and we're talking 1987. And at that point, I as an English deputy head, hadn't come across a child of 9 with a diagnosis of ADHD who was taking medication. This was a phenomenon. And I was taken by the fact that it was the category, this child became this thing and was dealt with as per their label.
Yes.
And thereafter, we realized this child had a name and a particular personality and a particular way in which that ADHD was working out for them, compared perhaps to a peer who might also have a diagnosis. So the model of categorizing, the model of labeling, the model of kind of medicalizing things has its benefits to some extent, in that we can begin to read around and understand and look for strategies that might work. So that's the tick, but also can have its disadvantages, particularly for those who don't necessarily have the necessary passion for learning diversity and SEND, because what it appears is it's another child who's different. It's another child who's difficult.
Yes. That's the thing. I think when we get into the world of dyslexia and ADHD and autism and all the neurodivergent labels, is they're all best fit labels. This is where this child best fits into, which is autism. This child best fits into this one, and this one actually fits into all of them. But it's not a pure this. Even if you had pure autism, you could bottle it. It'd always be a different. Every time you had a drink from it, would be a different flavor.
Yeah.
Even if it was pure autism, it'd be a different flavor every time. Every mouthful. How's it changed again? Because it's autism.
Yeah. And it's personality in autism, isn't it?
Yes.
It's that holistic, sort of multidimensional, multifaceted sort of aspect. But the way that we train our teachers is very much around a set piece in terms of the label, and then we enter into the solutions. So we haven't quite got to this bit about high value strategies yet. We're just sort of sticking around the edges, and the edges have to address our human need to understand things, and our human need to understand things is very often captured in the need to categorize. If we think about ourselves as young children, or if we look at a young child playing, they will be organizing all the red stuff over here, and they'll all be organizing the shoes over here. Any child will do that at particular developmental stages. So we have within our world, within our human condition, that need to categorize. So this label-led model kind of suits us then. And I think there are teachers and families out there who seek to understand their children absolutely through a diagnosis. There are adults who feel they know themselves better, quite rightly, because of a diagnosis. They can revisit themselves within that diagnosis. So there are huge positives.
I think a label is, I always use it as a starting point. Your child's got autism. Go read a book on autism. That's a really good starting point. If I gave you some really random specific term, there probably won't be a book on that. But if I start you in autism, it's going to help you think about and understand if you want to go do that research. However, as you read through that book, you'll just read loads of go, yeah, that's not my child. Yeah, that's not my child. That's my child. Yes. But it gives you a ballpark of where to start. And that's what I find with most of these. It generally just gives you that starting point. It's a way to easily describe a group of traits and link them together. That's, to me, what that's really about. Because neurodivergent is divergent and no one's the same. So you can't really say they're this. It's going to be a complete mix. But the easiest way is to categorize. Rather than having 5 million categories, let's just have 5. They don't fit that well, but it's easy.
And I think where you're absolutely, teasing out the need to go deeper and wider and to understand that person better on that day, remembering that person's going to be older by a week next week and older by a month next month, and they're going to continually be evolving as a person. So it's only ever a snapshot when we understand somebody's autism on the day. We possibly take on the head knowledge that people vary within that autism kind of structure, that framework. To really get under the skin of that, we need to talk to a number of, we're talking autism here, let's go with that. We need to talk to a number of autistic people to see how very different that pans out within their lives. We can read. So Sarah Hendricks, for example, has written an interesting book on girls and women experience of autism. And that really does showcase different perspectives from real people on how autism is playing out in their lives. So I guess the kind of the first point here in understanding this categories, this need for categorization, which is a positive thing to some extent, is to genuinely experience other people's take on the differences that has made to their lives. And that is true professional development. That's the start of understanding, which is what we subscribe to when we look at training for teachers. So the categorization model, you said there, Dale, something around the notion that very often there are a mixture of things going on. And there is a great deal of research which is being strengthened hugely by the emerging neuroscience, the world of neuroscience, that is telling us that what we didn't know already, brains are very complicated, so they don't work in silos. So the chances are that we have a lot of co-occurrence. It used to be called comorbidity, but that's a really dreadful word. Co-occurrence. So an ADHD and an autism, an ADHD and a dyslexia, the mix and match of those apparently separate things is a big factor in many people's lives. And it is perhaps less usual to have a single diagnosis or a single place to land that category than without that kind of mix. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think what you might find is you go, oh no, they're just autistic. It's like, yeah, as you support that better, something else might start to shine. Because if they're autistic and they're not getting involved in that learning, they're not sitting down and reading, they're not doing that, and you can finally get them engaged in that learning, then you might find they're dyslexic as well. So there's often one which is very apparent, which is normally the disruptive one.
Absolutely.
And then when you finally kind of get them into that, being involved in that, engaging in their learning, then you might see something else.
And it all depends, as you say, which area of disruption perhaps has taken that person through the diagnostic door. So do you get in the queue for ADHD first? and then you've lost your energy to get in any other queue at all? Or do you get in the queue for something else? If you happen to live in a local authority that doesn't necessarily subscribe to the actual language of dyslexia, and we do have many local authorities in the country who do not necessarily
Believe in dyslexia.
subscribe to the diagnosis of dyslexia, then as a Senko out there, you'll be in a rather interesting place. Clearly, we do have 10% of the population who have long-term literacy and or dyslexic needs.
And also, as you touched on, if you're a girl and you're not disruptive, you probably won't even queue behind a door.
Yeah.
Because you're not disrupting anyone.
And that's obviously, you're absolutely right. And we are fortunately seeing much, much more happening around diagnosis for girls and autism, and a slight increase with the ADHD as well. There was some interesting research done by Paul, shouldn't have started that, forgotten his name, by Paul Cooper, around the ADHD profile without the H. So we're talking about attention deficit disorder. And it may have been touched on in previous podcasts, but looking at those young people, often girls, who appear to have attention difficulties, might be described as a little bit dreamy. You kind of go along and you say, yeah, just pop two things down and I'll come back. And then they've gone off into their own world again. So essentially the brain is as hyperactively disrupted as perhaps somebody who's obviously in a hyperactive sort of behavioral state. But the impact on those girls, particularly on their ability to achieve well academically, is just as great, if not more so. And they very much go under the radar.
I always like that, the inattentive ADHD or ADD or ADHD type 1, whatever is always something going, I always like it. I'm not hyperactive in the physical world. I'm very hyperactive in my mind. But that doesn't seem to, if you say ADD, it's like attention deficit. I know, I'm very much attention to something, it's just not you.
Yes.
Or what you want me to be interested in.
If I'm autistic as well, I'll tell you.
Yes. That's me.
Which then results in a little visit to somebody's office, no doubt. So yes, all of these things very much in the mix. Now, why are we going here with this categorization? Because the SEN industry, I'm going to say it, the SEN industry has grown up over the last 40 years, thank you, Mary Warnock, with the need to respond, the need to recognize, the need for conversations that are led by people who know, and ultimately a group of people perceived as being specialists who are then available to have those conversations about either we need to identify, we need to assess, we need to see what's going on, or to have those conversations about, well, now that we know, let's talk about what we do, or those conversations that say, well, we don't have a diagnosis, but what we see in front of our eyes requires this type of response. So a group of specialists has emerged over the last 40 years in order to develop those important conversations within schools about how to teach these young people effectively. That then also means that implicitly those people should be involved in training and CPD. Books are written, have been written, and are available to upskill people, another form of professional development. And gradually over the years, we have the emergence of strategies that suit certain types of perceived profiles, SEN profiles. And we have additionally, YouTube clips, podcasts, we have case studies, we have research, and oftentimes they are located within a specific category. We also have organizations who are located within specific categories. So we have the National Autistic Society, we have the British Dyslexia Association, and so it is quite separate entities around separate aspects of the brain.
We do. And that's the sort of thing, again, it helps people. It's that starting point again, isn't it? So my child struggling with reading or writing, dyslexia. Okay, so I might go to British Dyslexia Association. That's probably my best chance of getting help. And there's so it really is. It's that starting point. But I think some people also see it as the ending point. And that's where we get into those difficulties, that everything you need is within this organization. And this is the only thing your child's going to be struggling with. But it's also and it's kind of, and it is kind of, there are walls between these organizations. Like it or not, there are these walls, and they never kind of look at each other sideways, or don't appear to be, and going, oh, hang on. Your lot have that, your lot struggle with that lot as well. Oh, our lot struggle with that lot. We could do something together. That doesn't happen.
That's an insight I've just gained from this conversation, which I should have known. But clearly, where do we see the British Dyslexia Association working with the NAS, the National Autistic Society? There's that joined upness. So ICANN and the other organisations have now reformulated to become the, what is it? It's gone. Speech and Language UK. There we go. I found it again. Speech and Language UK. But we know, and we're getting to that point in this discussion, we do know that there are common features within some of these categories, but we're not reminded, we're not visually reminded and internet reminded and organisational reminded that these things very often co-occur.
And I know the kind of reasons, because part of it comes down to control. Part of it is that sort of, we have this organization, we do this, and there is that sort of element of, we want to control and ensure the quality of all that information we provide. So there is certain, if you're working with an organization, there's a pecking order thing going on, and I can but fundamentally, we should all be at the heart. The overall aim of every single one of these organizations is to make children's lives better. And sometimes that occasionally does get lost. But I think overall, every organization involved in the SEND industry is about making children, young people's and adults' lives better. We just don't necessarily know how to all come together to achieve.
And that, I think, is where SENCOs have got a magic starting place, because you have, leaders of SEND have the opportunity to evolve the conversation. And if the conversations are very much around, let's throw the net wide, let's really plot some of the things that might be going on underneath the surface, rather than taking a single focused route, for example, saying, what do we think it is? Who shall we refer to? That's a single focused approach. Whereas if we're talking about looking at a range of things that might be co-occurring, we're much more playing into the neuroscience story that is developing, that the brain is wired in complex ways and it works across itself, not in silos. And SENCO's having that open-minded Sherlock Holmes type of sleuthing conversation, mapping the various things that we see above the surface, using the iceberg principle and asking those incredibly powerful questions underneath the surface, so that we can begin to see, we appear to have some working memory issues. We have some processing information, large amounts of information issues, that language processing kind of delay or difference. We might have some issues that are going on around getting information from the brain down through the hand into the handwriting. So that's another. It's plotting it. It's building that big piece of the puzzle, looking at those things that are firing on all cylinders, that are working well, beginning to almost map and gap that person to see where the bits and bobs aren't quite fitting maybe as they should. And that comes through amazingly clever questioning skills, which starts and is gifted to those leaders of SEND in our schools and educational organisations, to SENCOs, to start getting that mapping exercise going.
And it's important when you're doing this mapping exercise, if you believe that child has autism, don't just go through an autism list of questions.
Yeah.
Really important. Cast your net wider.
Yeah, absolutely. And that might be that you begin to hone, as a SENCO, your skills in asking a range of questions. So you're building your observational skills of what you're seeing, you're interpreting that into the questions you need to ask, you're triangulating information from the young person, from the parents, the siblings, the family aspect, and from teachers and peers. You're really getting a strong triangulation of information, and you're mapping it through those incredibly insightful questions. And then you are you're doing that first high value thing. You're getting a great map of what that young person is bringing to learning. Now, that's a very different conversation than mapping the child's needs, gaps, difficulties, you know, the holes in the puzzle, as it were. Every child brings something to learning, and the mapping exercise needs to identify what that is and where those differences and or gaps sit. So that's kind of high value job one, in a sense. Yes, we know that sometimes you have to pick and choose, and if you want to go for a diagnosis, you've got to gather together a group of things and go for something. But don't then close the door.
To all the other things.
Absolutely. So getting to that place through wiring in fabulous conversations to kind of map what that young person brings to learning is a high value place to start. Doing the research and the reading around how frequently some of these things co-occur with each other. So I think it's Russell and Pavelka, 2019, if I've got that one right. No, 2013, I lie. Say something about 70-ish. It's not very technical, is it? 70-ish% of those with an autism diagnosis may also have traits or have sufficient to be diagnosed with ADHD. That's quite a high percentage.
And just to be clear, I have both. I'm ADHD,
ADHD.
but I'm in a Reddit for ADHD people, and I read it and I flick through and I'm going, I'm not like any of this lot. And that's a fascinating thing. Although I've got these two things, my flavour is very different to most other people's in this group. And so that's the thing, when I see all these traits and things, I just going, it's a load of rubbish to me. I am very unique. And it's just what works for me would not work for all of these people here. So when I hear all autistic people or any phrase with the word all, it really kind of winds me up that people think in such those siloed ways. And yeah, so that's the sort of thing is when you're doing all these things, if you sit there and collate all these things, and Angela's sitting there with huge, every time we're podcasting with Angela, she has a piece of paper she draws all over too. But if you kind of, when you're doing that thing, you're kind of creating that blank sheet. What do I notice about this child? What am I noticing? And write that down. And as Angela says, you might get to this point where you're putting a circle around a load of it going, oh, that's autism. But you don't then just dismiss those other things. It's really important that you can't go, well, that's not autism, so I must have made a mistake with that. No, we don't fit into those boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what makes life such fun. Yep.
It is.
It's multiple things that come together almost as a Venn diagram, so that you've got a little bit over in this bit, a little bit over here, this bit co-occurs, but actually that talks to ADHD and this and that, and you're populating through that Venn diagram process potentially. So mapping, getting that kind of picture of what a young person is bringing to learning through triangulating conversations, observations, and your own rich knowledge through listening to Zencast, etc., is what's going to give you that fabulous set of questioning skills. Where next? When parents come to your school or setting, or a message comes through an email, or there's a child with something coming in our direction, what is the response? What is the ripple that goes across the staff? And how do we mitigate the risk of that ripple being a negative one? Oh, I've got 6 children with ADHD in my class already, and I can't keep doing all of these individual strategies, and I just can't take any more. So that child is going to land in a very, very high pressured environment where we have an overloaded teacher. And there are ways in which we try to mitigate that, which we'll come to shortly. But I think we have to be aware of the emotional state, the professional emotional state of teachers in schools. Not in a good place, many of our colleagues. And sometimes that 7th child with ADHD on top of the previous 6 might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And yet we want to be a community of belonging for all children. So therein lies the dilemma.
Yes. And it's interesting. I'm trying to work out, is like, so you got the negative ripple. Like, should there be a positive ripple? Yay, another ADHD. Well, that's, try to have that. But no ripple is also bad, because no ripple could be like, cool, I've got this, or it could be, I don't care. So I'm trying to work out what is the right ripple. It's probably a slightly positive, non-existent ripple that, oh, cool, I've got this. Is that what you really want?
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess you want a bedrock of confidence about the kind of key strategies that are recommended for ADHD, but then you need the conversation. Okay, let's talk to this young person and or the people who know them well and sort out how the ADHD is playing out for them.
Yes, because it is a starting point.
How is it playing out for them? Similarly with a diagnosis, we've just got a diagnosis of whatever. Okay, that's great. Let's talk about how it's playing out for this child, for you. Sammy, how's it going? Let's talk about it. Let's really get your ADHD sorted today, remembering it will be a bit different next week. And when Christmas comes, it's going to be way off the scale. So giving that dynamic flow to the whole process of becoming confident in the way we teach young people, in the way we organise our classrooms, is really, really important, because there will be days when nothing works.
Yeah. But what you're aiming for is that child to arrive in that class and that teacher kind of going, cool, I've got these adaptions in. Hopefully that will make life easier. It should do. We'll see how it goes. Not, I hope this works, and then have nothing. It's like they should have some things they can do automatically to support that child, which shouldn't be huge. And then going, is that the bit that he needs?
And I guess too, thinking back to other podcasts around pupil voice, person-centered approaches, we have a responsibility through and through to ensure that young people incrementally, day in, day out, get a handle on their own SEND profiles, whatever those might look like. Because as I've said before, the only person who's going to travel with themselves for their entire life is that person. And as teachers, as Senkos, as leaders, we've got an incredible kind of job of work, and what a privilege to help young people really begin to get to know themselves. There was a video from the Tourette's Association talking about, it was a mum who was saying, I thought I'd lost Brendan. That was before she realised that he had Tourette's, and before she found some like-minded people whose children also have Tourette's. So she said, I thought I'd lost Brendan, but then I found my way and I refound Brendan, and he's great. He's just got a little bit extra. And his little bit extra comes as a Tourette's profile.
Yes. What is that interesting is I thought I lost him, but then I found my way. And it's sort of like, so you hadn't lost him, he'd lost you.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing. When you hear the certain phrases people say is, Brendan was Brendan, you'd kind of lost how you connected with him, then you found your way. So Brendan was just there, was a constant the whole way through. It's our interpretation, our reaction, our understanding, and our acceptance that changes in those journeys.
Yeah, and that pulls on some quite emotive words, really, doesn't it? It talks about loss, bereavement almost, that the child I thought I had isn't the child that I now have. So have I lost the child I thought I have? But now I've found him again, and now I find he's got something extra. But there is a loss and gain cycle that families will go through. And depending on the cognitive stage of the young person when they receive their diagnosis, very often there can be a huge relief if, in fact, they wanted to know that, let's take dyslexia and a stereotypical thing here, I'm not stupid.
Yeah.
I'm dyslexic. Yeah. Or there can be a real pushback from children who perhaps gain a diagnosis and suddenly feel that they are fundamentally different from all their mates and that they're going to get picked on and bullied. So there will be different reactions from young people themselves about something that applies uniquely to them.
Yes. It's really interesting, but on the stage where they are, various things, and all their experiences up to that point will change. And I think most time to get that diagnosis, they would have struggled in various areas. You don't get a diagnosis when every day's been great. You get a diagnosis when every day's been hard.
Yeah.
and then trying to make those days easier. But yeah, some people really don't want that label. They want to be like everyone else. Some parents go, I don't want my child to be dyslexic. It's like, they are, whether they get that piece of paper or not. But the piece of paper just will hopefully unlock some support and some understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the benefits of what we're talking about here, and again, it's two sides of the coin, have to be weighed up with the fact that perhaps the majority of young people who do require SEN provision won't get a diagnosis at all. But their need for us to understand what they are bringing to learning is just as important as that diagnosis that a smaller proportion will get. And I guess there's something here, there's a clear message of sort of a moral imperative, a professional integrity that we as leaders of SEND have to apply, that those children who have a diagnosis don't land up having more attention from us than those children who clearly are exhibiting just a similar sort of learning profile. They need that provision, they need that intensity of conversation from us, but they're going to travel perhaps for much of their lives, if not all of their lives, with no clear diagnosis, but a little bit of this, 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 put it in a pot, and it makes life and learning really difficult.
But it is that a diagnosis isn't a key, shouldn't be a key for we change what we do. You should be going, oh, that child needs this, I will do this. You shouldn't need a diagnosis to change what you do.
Yeah, it's what we see and hear in front of our eyes, what's reported to us. And if we take a leaf out of the Equality Act 2010, it's very clear that a disability has a very low bar and that you do not have to have a diagnosis to be legally entitled to reasonable adjustments. It is the impact of that legally places you within the remit of the Equality Act. So, somebody may have long-term literacy difficulties. Over time, it is clear that they need a considerable amount of reasonable adjustment and potentially some intervention as well to help with that long-term literacy, but they do not have a diagnosis legally. What you see in front of your eyes places them within the Equality Act, and you are legally bound to reasonably adjust for them. I don't need to say that. We're morally bound, and of course we do it.
That's when we, who is the we?
We who invest in the very best for the young people that are right there doing school, and we have to handhold them through finding solutions into how they can do school successfully so that they find out how they can do life successfully. So where have we got to? We haven't got anywhere near high value strategies yet, but we've gone round a few houses.
It's what we do on the podcast. We travel a long way to get to the destination.
We travel. Yes, we mustn't miss the destination. So the industry that I have referred to doesn't do well with skilling teachers up in the right sort of knowledge about young people that are going to be in their classes. If 1 in 59 roughly have a diagnosis of autism, if 10% of the population is dyslexic, if we have a growing number of young people who have tics, Tourette's, the whole kind of caboodle here, and many, many more have cross-reference co-occurring facets within their makeup, then we spend a disproportionately tiny amount of time at initial teacher training, skilling our colleagues, our new colleagues up within the world of high incidence, I'll call it that, high incidence SEND. Every class will have a child who's autistic, who's dyslexic, who's got ADHD, who's sitting there with those same learning profiles, but without a diagnosis. Every single child, every single school, and probably most classes in all our schools. So we do a terribly bad job about it. That then is left to CPD in schools. CPD in schools is an interesting conundrum. When we look at the sort of research about how adults learn, we find that, again, we don't do this terribly well. We don't invest in andragogy, the art of teachers learning, teachers teaching teachers, that whole kind of business of getting buy-in from teachers to doing something different, to seeing the purpose of changing a little tweak within their planning and delivery of a lesson. We don't do terribly well in encouraging that participative pupil-teacher voice exchange before lessons, during lessons, after lessons. So we don't necessarily move our practice on organically by talking with young people about how learning is going in the spirit of reflecting on our teaching and putting in some changes there. And we don't necessarily invest in sort of CPD that really makes a fundamental difference. So let's just look at CPD for a moment. Senkos, there are probably 3 main types of professional development. We'll get to the content in a moment, but let's look at the platforms and let's look at the mechanics. We've got the set piece, 20 minutes twilight staff meeting. Dreaded by many Senkos, it has to be said, because it's your peer group, you're put on the spot, you do your research, you do your delivery, and there may or may not be an expectation that something will change as an outcome of that twilight session. If we can wire an expectation into that twilight session of change, then have that pile of post-it notes right next to you, give them out, get the names put on. One small thing you're going to do, put them up on the wall, take a photo, follow it up in a very supportive, how's it going type of way. But too often we deliver hit and run, gone.
I always think that CPD with schools is what we learn about learning in general in terms of time and energy levels and when we're awake. Almost like the after school is like the worst possible time to learn, but that's when we all do it. And it's one of the things I find that a lot of time things are done when they are convenient rather than when they are effective. So when I have a conversation with my children about their behavior, I have it at a time which is good for me, not necessarily a time which is good for them, which means the effectiveness of that conversation is generally not that effective. But if I then go, when would be a good time to have that conversation for my child? I will probably have a better outcome from that situation. So we don't do that, I think, in terms of CPD in lots of ways. We've got the bad time. And I always think, as you said, I see in the groups I'm in, I need to deliver training on blah on Tuesday. Has anyone got any slides? And I find that really, 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 really strange and confusing. Because if I'm going to be delivering 20 minutes training in my school, I'm going to be looking around a school and going, what are we not doing well? That. I'm going to focus on that. The idea, what we need to do should come from within the school, not just what's fashionable. I should be trying to make a difference in my school, and I make a difference where we've got a problem. So some of these things, when I see people coming up with what they're going to do, and I'm like going, it kind of, to me, might be the way my brain works, is I find the problem and then I look at the solution. It sorts itself out. The training would just kind of, well, I use some examples of what's not gone well. I might use some of what has gone well. You use some external stuff, and yeah, that should probably fill 20 minutes. And hopefully, because I've chosen something which is quite pertinent, quite happening in my school, it should be, the buy-in should be there. But if I'm delivering something which we're not really struggling with in the school, but it's fashionable or it's the latest thing or everyone else is doing it, so we should, I'm probably going to have an absolutely zero impact.
So the principles of andragogy is the buy-in comes because what you're doing has a real time kind of significance for that person. They need a solution to a problem, or they've got a particular thing that they're involved in, and this is enhancing their place in time right now.
Yes.
So it's relevant.
Yes.
And relevance means buy-in. So absolutely. And I think we don't use data enough to say we've got a high incidence of young people with co-occurring dyslexia and autism. Therefore, what we're going to be looking at is the high value strategies around those young people, but we're not going to do it through a set piece 20-minute session. We're going to do it through a range of different mechanisms. And one of the most effective mechanisms is not to do dedicated SEN training, but to influence the training of others, so the English department, the maths department, to influence the training around other key CPD aspects in the school by having the SEN perspective. And if we are doing that, we are not siloing SEN, ticking the box, it's done. We are showing that it is an integral part of everyday life in our school, and that whatever CPD strategic plan we have for the year, thinking about those high value strategies for young people with an SEND profile fits into that CPD strategy for the school. And in terms of platforms, that's potentially one of the most powerful, but it's quite a difficult place to get to if you happen to be in a large secondary school.
But that's probably the most important thing, because if you are the Senko standing up and doing training, it's those for those kids. Or even if the English lead did their bit and they go, you had a bit for SEN at the end, it's like, I can stop listening now, she's talking. You get that sort of approach. When the English lead is saying everything, you've now got buy-in from them. They are telling everyone. And it also means it's kind of their responsibility to also follow up on it. So it's not one person's voice. Now we've got the Senko and the English lead and the maths lead giving us good advice around SEN. We should all be listening.
Yeah. And when we get to the kind of high value strategies issue, if we've got some 3 or 4 key messages around those that will run good for the year, then those will keep coming out, but in different formats according to whether it's the maths focus, the English focus. We're going to start forest schools. Okay, what's that going to mean for this particular group of young people? So who delivers, the messages they deliver, and the kind of stand-up takeaway from staff is a really important start point when we begin to look at de-siloing SEN. Don't think that's a word, but you know what I mean.
Should be a word.
From the community in which we function. And we're modelling what young people who require SEN provision should be expecting from us in the schools from their peers. That they're not a siloed group, they're part of the fabric of the school. So modelling that through our interaction and our CPD plans is hugely important. So on top of that, coaching, Senko surgeries, the opportunity for good quality conversations is always a great way to go. And again, when we come to look at some of the high value strategies, those can be messaged really strongly through dedicated Senko surgery time. It's a pushback. That feeling as a Senko, you get out the car, if you come to school in a car, or you get off the bus or tube or whatever, walk to school, and somebody shouts across to you, "Oh, Angela, yeah, just in your Senko role, can I just talk to you about John, please, later on today?" You get into the school, go up the corridor, you haven't even hung your coat up yet, and somebody says, "Angela, I do need to talk to you about Pam and Susie, because, they have got SEN and that. Can you sort it?" So I then go get my cup of coffee, and somebody comes up and says, "Yeah, I need to talk to you about Tommy and Johnny. I've got 6 or 7 kids now. They're not my kids, they're your kids." And that whole kind of Senko mentality of, what is it that's on my forehead that tells you that I can sort this? It's like living in a piranha pool where bits and chunks are kind of taken out of you. So this is where discussing and rehearsing and reiterating some of those high value strategies can be better placed within Senko surgery, within dedicated coaching sessions, if you can create that time, and within co-researching teacher groups, and also by sharing good practice. Teacher in year 5 had that same issue. This is what they did. Let's put a conversation together. Okay, so lots of platforms, lots of mechanisms. So let's have a little look at the what. We've looked at the kind of platforms, but we need to now distill down and have a think about what 4 or 5 things, that's probably a few too many, 3 or 4 things, seem to work really efficiently for different groups of young people. And we've talked right at the beginning about, shall we be dyslexia friendly this term? Shall we be autism friendly next term? And shall we be Tourette's friendly the term afterwards? And shall we get our badge? There are, and you've said it, Dale, there are lots of features that are very similar. So let's test this out. The executive functioning skills that we're all apparently wired with are suggested as being a kind of core issue when it comes to some of our highest incidence CN categories. So ADHD, difficulties with working memory, ADHD, difficulties with flexible thinking, and ADHD, difficulties with kind of regulating and holding off on those behaviors and that kind of cause and effect. Okay, let's turn to the autism websites. Lo and behold, difficulties with flexible thoughts, thinking. Working memory is questionable. Let's leave that within the dyslexia population, perhaps. But again, that modification of one's kind of self-regulation can be a little bit of a challenge. And then when we do look at a dyslexic or a specific learning difficulty kind of dyscalculic profile, again, working memory comes up, as does processing lots of language, lots of information. If we've got, as nationally, the highest population seems to be indicating a large number of young people with developmental language disorders. And I'm not just talking about COVID language delay, talking about long-term stuff here. Clearly, processing lots of language at one bite of a cherry is very difficult, as is working memory, as is applying information and utilizing it in flexible ways. So we seem to be coalescing around two or three things.
Yep.
Yeah. Those things coming across.
Oh, yeah.
So if we were to think about identifying those things that keep bobbing up to the surface, is there a way that we can broaden that kind of evidence base out just a little bit and translate it into things, therefore, that the teacher can do or the teachers can do?
That thing is, not only are these areas common across, the way you support them is the same. It's not, oh, they're struggling with this, well, they're dyslexic or autistic, it depends on what I do. No, it's the same thing you're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. This is where taking the overload out of our teaching colleagues is so vitally important, and making this possible is the place to go. So a little bit of work done internationally with a large number of schools. We're talking kind of 180, nearly 200 schools, where we used some platforms to gain pupil voice about what made lessons go well, what was more difficult. And we have since developed what we call a pupil learning checklist that has got a number of very simple but quite detailed strategies that suggest what young people find helpful that teachers can do. That wasn't put very well. That meeting in the middle, if teachers do something, that really helps in terms of those young people. And when we drew in the evidence from these pupil voice interviews, semi-structured interviews, we spread all the pieces of paper around the floor, and we realized that children were asking for teachers to slow down. That didn't seem very technical. Children were asking for teachers to summarize the main points at the end of a whole spiel. Because if there's anything teachers like to do, it's talk. So they were asking for that kind of chunk and freeze. What else bobbed to the surface that children were asking for, no matter whether they were primary or secondary, was some visual or gestural cues to help them to use what is often the case in a number of young people, those stronger visual skills, so that they could get visual hooks on being able to organize their thoughts and plan an independent piece of work, or plan some of the input into the conversation in a small group. So what have we got so far? Slowing down, reframing main messages, and using what we call chunk and freeze, which is to bring the main points of something you're saying into a place, and pausing, allowing that processing to take place, and supporting what we're talking about through gesture, through visual cues, and reframing and checking by getting pupils to talk back to us what they think they've got to do, which then begins to help with the planning and organisation. post-it notes, having post-it notes so that children can organise the order of things. Having visuals that are working with to the mindset of the young person. So earlier on, Dale and I were talking about time. I was saying, I often ask teachers, where do you see tomorrow? And they look at me very blank. And then some teachers will say, I see tomorrow in front of me. And therefore, I say, do you see yesterday behind you? Yes, I do. I see tomorrow to my right, and I see yesterday to my left. Some people see it in a spiral or a circle. Some people see it in colours. Some people haven't got the foggiest idea what I'm talking about and don't see it at all. But I know that when I organise, I have to organise left to right. But I might be working with somebody who needs to organise their planning top to bottom. So what are the high value strategies? Not imposing some of those more abstract things that work for us, presuming that the way we see a learning plan or a way to organise ourselves is the way that every child in our class sees it, but to allow some flexibility and freedom. And that's where good old post-it notes come in. So am I getting anywhere with some high value strategies? I've drawn my Venn diagram, and I've definitely got something to do with slowing down, chunk and freeze, and visually supporting things in that central basket.
So the ones that I know of from various guests, one are visual timetable. So that is that what's nice, simple, clear organization, what's coming up next. It helps with that flexibility of thought, that emotional regulation. And the other one, which comes up in lots of times, is helping them know what to focus on. If you've got a very busy front wall, I'm going to be looking at everything. If you make a quite simple front wall, there's one bit in the middle, I'm going to focus on that. So there are two, which have come, both of those have come up a lot with different guests. And it's not a big complicated, these are big complicated.
And that's what's scary about it, because we buy in specialists to tell us how to do this thing. And it feels almost like we're being cheated, because these things are incredibly, incredibly simple. And yet almost 200 young people from 200 different schools, a mix of primary and secondary, when we distilled all that information down, it was scarily simple.
But the other thing I think schools do is, let's say you have a child who needs that visual timetable. You do the visual timetable. Cool, they've got it. Let's remove it. No, just keep it there. Just keep it there. It's working. Why remove it?
How many of us use organisers on our phones? Yeah, and we can't do without them, because they give us a visual hook into what we're doing. We look at our calendars, we look at our organisers, and if somebody took them away from us, we'd be in an empty basket place. We wouldn't know where to go. So it is really important. We need to grow those things up so that the visual timetable for a year 9 a young person in year 9 looks fundamentally different from one in year 3, 2, etc. And we need to introduce these things really early. And one of the reasons for, again, suggesting the post-it notes and the highlighter pens is that it gives children, you're not giving children a fixed, your visual timetable, the way it works for you. You need to go through a few moments, and this needs to be conveyed to staff, whereby if the child is cognitively able, you present them with a couple of different types so that they then choose the one that's going to work for them.
Yes, because on your calendar, on your phone, you have a month view. You often have a week view. You often have a work week view. So you've got a couple of different, you can do a time. Some people do a timeline. You've got different views because it all works slightly differently. So there's lots of different things. Now, one thing, as we're talking through all of this, is when you're delivering your staff training, we're not just talking teaching children. We apply the same processes to teaching adults. So when you're doing your staff training, don't just stand up there with your notes and just talk to people. Do it in front of the whiteboard. Have some basic slides with those key bits of information which you're going to talk around. Do those gestures. Do the free. Do all those things to your staff as well. And if they get more in, you're kind of showing them how well it works. But one thing for me is, and again, how you work, and that's thing, you got to think about your level of knowledge as a Senko and your level of understanding of all these different terms and all these things is one thing. Your teacher's level, especially if you've got someone who's an NQT and it's September and you're going to throw a load of stuff in about autism about them, you've got to turn it round and go, what is it they need? What is the simplest bit of information I can give them to make us as a school more effective? And generally, it's going to be dropping that autism session, that dyslexia session, that ADHD session, and just going back to those key strategies that work for all learners and focus on them. Because if you're doing those, if you do these 3 or 4 or 5 things we mentioned, and you're doing them in your classrooms, that is going to make a big difference to every child, with a diagnosis, without a diagnosis. Even if you didn't have know they were struggling, it will make a difference. And it's the simplest way of providing that knowledge.
Bram Norwich, who professor at Exeter University, does a 2 or 3 minute video just talking about the strategies for teaching young people who have an SEND profile. Is they are not different things that you're getting out of the cupboard. They're an intensification. I think he uses the word an intensification of the good stuff you're doing as a teacher. And you have to encourage teachers to identify, what their preferred ways of teaching, and you add an intensification around that, so that we're preserving, in a sense, the right of teachers to teach. They have personalities, they have ways to do things, but there will be certain things that they need to notice about their teaching. That's the basis of the Teacher Standards Section 4, about being reflective. What does that actually mean? I noticed that worked for somebody. Shall I do a little bit more of it? Shall I extend it just a little bit? Shall I kind of try a little bit and see how far I can push this as a strategy? And then you've got that magic notion of growing or developing the bandwidth of confidence and competence. That's what we're after in our schools, that all of us broaden our bandwidth of confidence and competence in trying things out and exploring that intensification of things that we know work as good teachers, and then being aware of those high value strategies, slowing down, chunk and freeze, visual cueing systems that will be tailored and chosen in that kind of format that works for young people, and testing out through reflection what differences those are making, and remembering as well that anything we put in place, and it's always worth saying this when talking with staff, when you do something once, it won't work. And why is that? Because there is some research out there somewhere that says that if we want to change a behavior, it's going to take us roughly 66 goes. That's probably a bit much, but roughly, in order to change that behavior. Let's just test that out. When you get home, if you're on your way to work now, when you get home, see if you remember this one, good working memory task, move your kitchen bin and test yourself as to how many days it takes you before you automatically remember the new position of your kitchen bin.
Now, there's also research which says some people simply kind of don't develop habits. So things like brushing teeth, things like that, will never turn into a habit. You have to make a conscious thought about it every time. And it's a really interesting thing. I'm literally going, oh, that makes more sense. So should I be moaning at my children, or should I just maybe accept that they might not get a habit? And I just put this little thing, 'cause it doesn't really cost me much. And it's those sorts of things. We reframe our mind into these things and just change our expectations slightly, tweak how we do it, but just kind of overall, we want to make a difference. The children don't want to be annoying. They don't want to be this. They don't want to be that. They don't want to be bottom of the class. They want to learn. And that's one of the things when people talk about children not making progress, it's like, do you think they weren't trying? Or do you think there might have been a barrier? There might have been something in their way preventing them. It's not a case of some children are working half the time. It's something they need support with to unlock that potential.
Yeah, and I think for some children who have not had success in learning early on, as perceived success as perceived by the system, then they're given they're given tools, and sometimes, if we're fortunate to have the resources, they're given people. But in doing that over time, it is possible that some young people will lose their identity as learners, that they no longer see themselves as learners. And getting them back to that place is quite a big ask.
It's interesting. Somebody on the podcast said the role of a TA is to make themselves redundant. And I think a lot of people don't think like that. I think parents think a TA is a golden ticket. But I think some schools think that TA is with that child, and it's not questioned. It's not question of, is it needed?
That comes to some work that I've done quite often with staff around articulating the purpose of a teaching assistant without using the word support. So if you play that game, with a flip chart, yeah, let's describe the purpose of a teaching assistant, but do not use the word support. What are they there to do?
To help them become independent.
So they're there as part of the teaching and learning team. Perhaps that's a good start point. And they're there to work with the teacher to facilitate independent learning behaviours.
Yep.
Yeah, with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a facilitative, potentially, to facilitate independent learning behaviours, which doesn't mean they walk away when they're not needed. But if the mantra is to have a focus on learning, not on task, to scaffold and facilitate, whatever is the word that kind of works, but to avoid anything that will give rise to the dependency culture.
Yes.
And to work all the time towards helping that young person to identify themselves as a learner. You did this.
It's helping them identify is independent strategies. So if you're giving this, what can you do to make it work for you? And it's that agency, that's kind of way of, okay, so when you get to that, if I write that down and look at it, it's working that out. They're not having someone do it for you. How can you do it on your own when I'm not here?
And if those high value strategies are at work in the classroom, so if I've got my visual tools, and those visual tools aren't just for me because I'm different, those visual tools are kind of across the board. If my teacher has reframed the key thing I need to do first, so I get it. If I've been given some pre-teaching around key vocabulary, and I'm going to get a little bit of post-teaching around the key vocabulary, so that I kind of got a picture on that. The tools are here to hand, high value strategies are at work, then you're giving me a better chance. So it's a combination factor, isn't it? It's building the bandwidth of confidence for teachers in our school, for all of us, bearing in mind there will always be some children who require SEN provision who fall outside of our bandwidth of confidence and competence. And that will be true for even the most experienced teacher. However, auditing that bandwidth of confidence and competence is not a bad idea. And then beginning to move it outwards so that we get a critical mass of teachers who understand the value of these high value strategies, these things that you agree as a school that need to be at work, alive and well in every classroom across your school. That's your basic grounding there, onto which you will build that kind of pupil voice engagement with teachers to make sure that young people with the uniqueness of their SEND profiles are beginning to thrive because they're getting a sense of how it works for them, and little by little that's being conveyed to those around them. But you have to start with a firm foundation.
Yes, you do. It's and that's the thing, is keeping that foundation simple. That really simple foundation. Don't complicate it. Keep it very simple. Keep it consistent year on year. It needs to be consistent, because if it's going to be a habit, you've got to do it 66 times.
Indeed.
So it's got to be built in, and you've got to be looking for that, not changing it as you use, like each term for whatever the speciality is this term. It's that consistent message delivered again and again. And also, you going back to what you said earlier, you want your English lead to be delivering the same thing, and the maths lead and the whoever else. So that really consistent message, because when they start hearing it from everyone, they will start to believe it and will start to implement it.
And don't forget your supply staff.
No, that's a whole other challenge, isn't it?
And if you've got very simple 3 high-value strategies that need to be at work in this school, in every classroom, you're giving your supply staff a much greater opportunity to survive. And the young people who have supply staff, which is, as you say, Dale, it's another whole story. If those strategies are in place, then the face may be different, but the strategies will still be there.
You want that consistent approach for the children. Makes life a lot easier. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Really enjoyed it. Yeah, it is, when you're delivering that information to staff, turn it around, think of it from their point of view, use all those strategies that we know work for children, use it for your staff to show them how it works and the importance of it. As always, I've got links from Angela, and I'll also be sharing Angela's contact details, and you'll find all of those in the show notes, whether you listen to the podcast or also on the Sendcast website. Please follow us on the social medias, on Twitter, Facebook, and and Instagram. You'll just search for the Sendcast and you'll find it. And if you listen to us through iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you can, give us 5 stars, leave a review, and let others know what you think. And before we go, I would just like to remind you to check out Sendcast Sessions. This is our video CPD. So as long as this podcast, we have this video CPD, and there are over 100 great sessions. And if you haven't accessed Sendcast Sessions before, a number of the guests on the podcast have recorded sessions, so you can go watch those. And we run 9 live sessions every year. And we also run 2 free send briefings every year. The paid sessions are £10 each per school. And you can watch them on the day if it's a live session, or you can watch them later on. They are yours forever. And it's a really, really good way to get CPD around SEND for all staff. So another thing we find with CPD is when somebody in your school is telling you something, you often don't listen. Sometimes that same message from someone else, which is very frustrating when you hear them take it on when someone else has said it. So it is a great way to get that CPD around SEND to everyone in your school. So thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Sendcast. It is goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Bye.